Welcome. My name is Matt Closer, and I'm joined by Chrissy Trinter and Gina Swarovski from the University of Notre Dame Center for STEM Education. And our presentation today is titled Framing STEM as a Force for Good. And what we'd like to do is think with you about how the intersection of our Catholic identity, that which makes our schools so distinct, can pair and elevate high quality STEM teaching and learning experiences for young people. Now, the title of our presentation is more than a tagline. It needs to be lived and enacted and operationalized in ways that are meaningful, that fully capture our Catholic identity, and provide students an intellectually rigorous experience within these disciplines. So take a second to think about each part in this phrase. STEM, a force for good. What do each of these really mean? Now, you didn't know it when you joined this session, but there are a few quiz questions that you're going to have to answer to get through it. So first, what does STEM mean to you? Here are three options: an interdisciplinary set of ideas and practices, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, the disciplines, or the stalk of a plant. Well, of course, few acronyms are more recognizable in education than STEM when we talk about science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. But we want to reference something that goes far beyond just the disciplines. We want to think about the intersection of how these disciplines inform each other, as well as the core ideas, the disciplinary practices, how one goes about being an engineer and being a mathematician, the types of questions that are raised, and ways of thinking that address the natural, symbolic, built, and material world that help these disciplines inform our lives. It's so important when we talk about high quality STEM education that we think of these principles not just facts and rote knowledge, so that students can have an intellectually rich experience and reach their full potential. Second, what do we mean by a force? Is it a push or a pull? Is it a coercion or a compulsion? Or is it an agent of change? Forces are active things. So as you thought about those words, the colloquial idea of push or pull, yes, what's happening there is that they're acting in a system. From an elementary physics point of view, we think of forces in terms of pushes and pulls. From our perspective, we're pushing beyond that again, that we see forces as agents of change. Like any force, we can affect systems, like those pushes and pulls that cause accelerations and affect the relationships of objects within a system. We too, as teachers and leaders, can be powerful agents of change. We are not just passive, but rather active workers within our systems. Active people who want to engage the hearts and minds and souls of our students, who can move beyond, again, just rote ideas about science content or doing algorithms in math, but instructionally and through our curriculum, be agents of change. Third, for good. Is it a favorable character or tendency? Is it promoting human flourishing? Or is it a good, something that has economic utility? For this presentation, we're talking about this idea of full human flourishing. How can we address concepts and integrate these ideas from the STEM principles, the core ideas, the practices, the questions asked, that move beyond a vague notion of good and towards some prized goods that we are seeking, those of equity, social justice, and human flourishing? In this session, we'll explore more deeply the connection of the STEM disciplines and their interdisciplinary ways of interacting, of being agents of change as teachers and putting students in positions to be agents of change so that they can create good in their communities. They can move towards accessing more equitable solutions, identifying issues of social justice, and moving towards a more peaceful and humane world around us that reflects the Gospels and the message of Christ. Now, again, this could all be very vague. We could leave it here and know we have to have something that's focused on STEM and we need to be agents of change and something for good. But that's very difficult to operationalize from that tagline. And what we found is that Catholic social teaching can be a great mechanism for making this happen in your classroom. Now, there are many different principles of Catholic social teaching and different lists, but we have selected 4 that we think are both critical from a theological perspective, but also really tied to the work of education. These are not an exclusive list. There are others that you will likely draw on in your teaching explicitly and implicitly. But today we'll focus on these 4. Elevating the dignity of the individual, promoting the common good, acting with rights and responsibilities, and empowering the marginalized and vulnerable. That's at the heart of this work, where we can apply these tenets, where we think about the dignity of the individual, where we can think about how can our curriculum promote the common good with our students who are engaging in these STEM ideas. And so we'll present each of these, we'll outline some foundational principles and definitions about equity, and then we'll look at each of these 4 tenets, describing what that tenet contains or how it's reflected, and also provide examples of how it might be lived in a STEM classroom. So right now, I'll switch the spotlight over to Gina, as she will provide some of these foundational definitions, and then move on to the tenets of focusing on elevating the dignity of the individual and empowering the marginalized and the vulnerable.
Thanks so much, Matt. Before we get too far along, we wanted to share some foundational definitions with you in order to develop a shared vocabulary and understanding. As Matt mentioned, while the theme of the session is STEM as a force for good, it's much more than a tagline for us. This work is grounded in equity and social justice. We consider equity to mean that every person has access to what they need to survive and ultimately thrive and flourish within a community. I should note here that equity is not the same as equality. I'm sure this image is familiar to many, but it is a useful tool. With equality, the image on the left, everyone gets the same thing. In this picture, everyone gets the same box, but that may not lead to everyone being able to participate in the activity, which here is watching the game. With equity, everyone gets what they need. Everyone in this picture now has what they need to see the game and take it in. Of course, this is a very simplified model of very complex things, but it's a good way to remember the difference between these 2 ideas. Now, another one of our foundational definitions is social justice. And much like equity, it is both a process and a goal. The goal of social justice is full and equal participation of all groups in a society that is mutually shaped to meet their needs. Social justice includes a vision of society in which the distribution of resources is equitable and all members are psychologically and physically safe and secure. So if we go back to our image, we see here on the far right in the panel for justice that the fence is replaced with a see-through version. That way, everyone can take in the game and they already have what they need to do so. The design of the space presumably considered that some of the folks watching the game would have different needs. So they opted for a fencing choice that did not prevent anyone from viewing the game. Again, these are really complex ideas that are difficult to represent in a set of static images. But these always help me keep these concepts in mind and differentiated from each other. So, we want to acknowledge that there are many different ways to understand and engage with equity and social justice. Our approach here is that not only do we need to identify and acknowledge barriers to equity and social justice, but also we are called to take action. We are called to do something. We are called to be an agent of change. But the actions that we take are more powerful if they are intentional and focused. And that is where the equity and social justice framework comes in. So I'll start now by going over the first two tenets in our framework, beginning with elevating the dignity of the individual. We believe that all humans are sacred, and the dignity of the individual is the foundation for a just and moral society. Every person is precious, and people are more important than things. Dignity does not come from the work we do, but the people we are. The dignity of the human person, realized in community with others, is the criterion against which all aspects of economic life must be measured. STEM can be a pathway to helping individuals more fully live into their dignity. When this happens, they feel valued. They feel that they have worth simply by being who they are, and they can feel empowered in their surroundings. In the STEM classroom, we can focus on this tenet in a number of ways. For example, we can ask ourselves about the assumptions we might be making regarding struggling students, say in our math class, and how those assumptions may impact the way that we interact with them. Do these interactions center the dignity of the student throughout the day? How might I adapt the ways that I interact with struggling students to help them feel more valued, worthwhile, and empowered? Or perhaps we can take a curricular approach and contextualize an engineering design activity within a real world, community based setting, where students can develop empathy for the people they are designing for who may be in challenging situations. And ultimately, they can consider how their engineering solutions can more fully elevate the dignity of those they are ultimately designing for. The next tenet in our framework is empowering the marginalized and vulnerable. We believe that a basic moral test of our society is to consider how the most vulnerable members of our community are faring. We must ask ourselves who in our communities are cast aside, forgotten, and marginalized, and perhaps more importantly, why? The answers to this question may be quite difficult to acknowledge and accept, but in order to enact real and lasting change, we have to face them. We have an obligation to ensure justice, access, and opportunity for all. The primary purpose of this special commitment to empowering the marginalized and vulnerable is to enable them to become active participants in the life of society. It is to enable all persons to share in and contribute to the common good. So, STEM can be a pathway to walking with individuals at the margins and ensuring justice, access, and opportunity. When this happens, the marginalized and vulnerable can have the empowering sense of feeling seen, of having their own lived experience acknowledged and valued. STEM can help people develop a sense of agency and ownership over their own lives, allowing them to more fully engage in human flourishing. In the STEM classroom, we can focus on this tenet by first understanding and acknowledging that many of our students may feel marginalized and vulnerable in ways that may not be completely obvious. How can we further support and advocate for our students and better understand when and how they encounter barriers to flourishing? We can also focus on this tenet in the classroom, specifically through instructional practices. For example, when we design group activities, We can clearly articulate group norms and expectations, as well as distribute responsibilities and access to experiences so that each student can meaningfully participate and engage in a particular activity. And now I'll turn it over to Chrissy to talk about the next two tenets in our framework.
Thank you, Gina. Promoting the common good is the next tenet in our framework. We believe that people are social. How we organize our society in economics and politics, in law and policy, directly affects human dignity and the capacity of individuals to grow in community. We believe people have a right and a duty to participate in society, seeking together the common good and well-being of all, especially the poor and vulnerable. No one wins unless everyone wins. STEM can be a pathway to helping communities thrive and flourish. When individuals come together to promote the common good, they find value in each other and in being in community. We see people collaborating together, working together to improve the conditions of the community, and ultimately contributing to the betterment of each other. In the STEM classroom, we can focus on this tenet through contextualizing activities within social justice contexts. For example, we could potentially connect a science unit on water filtration to a relevant local context, such as the ongoing cleaning up of a local water source. Or in a math class, we could explore the amount of pollution generated by different types of transportation with a data visualization, and then make connections to thinking about how to reduce pollution for the common good. The fourth and final tenet in our framework is acting with rights and responsibilities. We believe that all people have the right to participate fully in society. It is the responsibility of all members of society to support others, especially the most vulnerable, in living into their rights. Human dignity can be protected and a healthy community can be achieved only if human rights are protected and responsibilities are met. Therefore, every person has a fundamental right to those things required for human decency. Corresponding to these rights are duties and responsibilities to one another, to our families, and to the larger society. STEM can be a pathway to holding us accountable to our responsibility to others and ensuring the rights of all. STEM can afford us the opportunity to step into our responsibility and take action for the betterment of others. Sometimes this can be operationalized by making and holding space for others in the community to be heard, or by courageously speaking truth to power when we see something isn't right. In the STEM classroom, we can focus on this tenet by reviewing our curriculum broadly with an equity lens, examining who is represented and in what way. We can also commit to taking underrepresented groups in STEM and consider ways to disrupt those barriers within our own settings. So to bring this all together, as Matt mentioned earlier, these are 4 tenets of Catholic social teaching that we believe provide a useful frame for enacting STEM as a force for good. Keeping these tenets in mind, I will now share some ideas about how you might go about reflecting on your classroom practice. In particular, I will share a series of reflection questions you might use to analyze a lesson, unit, or other instructional movement to enact STEM as a force for good through the lens of these 4 tenets. As we know, every student in our class has inherent value, and the choices we make about how to instruct each student reflects our expectations of each one of them. For example, in a mathematics classroom, students should be engaging in what the National Council for Teachers of Mathematics has described as worthwhile mathematical tasks. For example, worthwhile tasks take into account current understanding of students to allow for multiple entry points and solution strategies, and provides an opportunity for the teacher to assess what the students already know, what they're learning, and what they're experiencing when they're experiencing difficulty. It is critical for teachers to keep the disciplinary content front and center when designing learning experiences that focus on using STEM as a force for good. So some of the reflection questions you might consider when you're thinking about keeping the disciplinary content front and center. Do my expectations of students' intellectual abilities and my curriculum reflect their innate dignity? Does the content of learning experiences for students align with major disciplinary ideas prioritized by professional organizations, standards documents, and student interests? Do students have opportunities to engage in disciplinary practice? For example, plan and carry out investigations, attend to precision, execute a design cycle to construct meaning about the world. Our classrooms are our communities for the time that we share them. What do you want your community to look like? How do you want students to feel in this space? To answer these questions, you might consider the structures and instructional approaches you choose to implement each day. When students' prior knowledge is accessed and built upon, they recognize your commitment to helping them learn both individually and collectively. This approach to equitable teaching and learning is supported through classroom norms that invite all voices to be heard. For example, providing students individual think time prior to sharing with a partner and then the whole class is a simple way of honoring all voices. This approach does not automatically shut out students who may otherwise be hesitant to speak first because they would have had time to process individually and share in a small group or partner setting prior to contributing to the whole group discussion. Another strategy is to invite students to write on a collective whiteboard or use Post-its to share ideas anonymously for groupthink. I'm sure you can think of many different ways that you're already using, which welcome all voices and ideas to the classroom learning experience. And some questions that you might consider when analyzing your own curriculum for being a force in particular for good. What explicit structures or instructional approaches position students' ideas and prior knowledge as central to the class's collective learning? What norms frame how all members of the community contribute to and participate in tasks? How are the voices of all students, especially those most often marginalized, heard and valued? The disciplinary and pedagogical choices I just discussed can be strengthened by curricular decisions that expose students to the world around them. In this way, we teachers have the opportunity to provoke students to think about where they might employ STEM disciplines in their everyday lives or communities. For example, you might choose to use data in a mathematics classroom that illuminates unjust disparities, such that students recognize the power of the discipline for making decisions and changing lives. In the science classroom, students might examine issues of social ecological justice, such as food sustainability and access to clean water. Students learning engineering might design buildings that can withstand earthquakes or violent water surges in places where these natural phenomena are more likely. In conclusion, maintaining a rigorous disciplinary focus while enacting equitable instructional moves and choosing contexts that address social justice issues are concrete ways of employing STEM as a force for good in your classroom. When thinking about the for good, you might consider questions such as, how might learning experiences be shaped to illuminate and address disparities among different groups? How might learning experiences promote the idea that no one wins unless everyone in a community wins? How might learning experiences empower students' participation and relationships with their family, school, community, government, or nation? What learning experiences authentically address the needs of those on the margins? Thank you for spending your time with us today and continue to shine a light on your students.